So this episode is called Tossing a Coin. So after about 2 months in mid-October, I went to CFBT and I told them I was going home at Christmas. I had not even considered a transfer to another school because I had been told you had to be in a school for at least 2 years before a transfer could be arranged. And in any case, I was pretty sure that many of the schools would be just as bad as my current one in the Water Village. So I was very surprised, but not particularly thrilled, to be offered a transfer to another school. I said I would think about it. I'd put a lot of work into the move to Brunei and a new school, and so another move didn't immediately appeal. However, when I considered everything, especially Maria's reaction, I decided I would give it a go, and I accepted a transfer to Menglait Secondary School. CFBT told me to say nothing to anybody at this stage. I was therefore very surprised when a few weeks later at a CFBT dance, people came up to me and said, "Oh, I hear you're going to Menglait." Yeah, I was furious. I'd kept quiet, but someone in CFBT administration had blabbed the news. It was really quite disconcerting when people came up to you and seemed to know more about my business than I did myself. For weeks I maintained my silence as requested by CFBT, but they did not confirm my transfer until the day before I went back to Australia at Christmas to collect the family. By then everybody seemed to know about the transfer except myself. It was very embarrassing at school in the Water Village. It was fantastic to get back to Australia for Christmas and see everybody. We had a very pleasant Christmas with some friends and their family, whose daughter was married to a Mexican. Of course, we had to rent the house, and that was a real pain in the neck. In the end, we ended up giving away so many things and storing others. And we gave away even our car, Bluey, who'd served us so well for 9 years. We stored a lot of things, and that caused a lot of problems later on because it was costly. Anyway, we arrived in Brunei in January, and when we arrived at the airport, the deputy head of CFBT was there to meet the new cohort. We took a few days to settle in. Almost immediately, Maria was offered a job at Al Falah School. This was a private, local Arabic school. It was important for her personally and her confidence to get offered this job. But it wasn't a great job, really. So we were under a lot of pressure with Maria in a new job, me in a new job, and kids in new schools and everything. I was starting a new school too. Fortunately, Menglait turned out to be much better than the first one in the Water Village. The head was quite a straightforward, simple man, and the students were much better behaved. Maria had a tough time adjusting to the Bruneian kids, but after a couple of months, she seemed to be getting on top of it all. I've reflected that in spite of my wide experience overseas, one can never really be prepared for each new experience. Each culture is so totally different that not a lot is really transferable from one experience to the next. In my opinion, this may go against the conventional wisdom, but it is my opinion nevertheless. One is always hearing that someone with overseas experience will be better prepared for another one. Well, yes, up to a point, but apart, not really so sure about it. To me, each culture is such a complete mystery that I only really ever get to scratch the surface after a couple of years, even after a few years living in the place. I've no time for the English travelogue approach to travel, like Michael Palin. Although it may be interesting, one learns virtually nothing on trips of this time of the cultures through which one passes as a tourist. I can only tell this, um, I can tell this by the crass and sometimes insensitive comments commentators like Palin make about the locals they encounter, often basing their sense of humour in that very personal English way of patronising people. They really have no idea how angry these people would be if they could really understand and get someone to translate what they are saying. In fact, I sometimes find myself thinking that it's a good thing that people don't understand each other's languages, because if people really knew what was being said about them, there would be much more conflict. STIP, S-T-I-P. This is an acronym for staying in the present. This is a Nixon acronym, something I thought about a lot at this time, the beginning of the Brunei experience. It actually comes from transactional analysis, which is a branch of psychotherapy which I was interested in Melbourne. More recently, I've come to realize its significance. When I was about 28, I considered myself pretty easygoing, and I think that's how others saw me. But I can't be sure because, as I've said many times before, I don't really know how other people see me. And this is a real problem for me. Anyway, at some stage in my 40s, I'm pretty sure that I became a real worrier. First, in the 90s in Australia, it was worrying about past failures and disasters. I used to think about them all the time during the day, dream about them every night, even having nightmares about them. But from about 2003 onwards, I started to worry more about the future of my children who were reaching university education age. They had this problem of not being able to stay in Brunei once they finished their high school. They were not legally allowed to stay and go to university. So we had an issue there about what we were going to do with our children. Then there was myself. What about my retirement and my old age? These thoughts soon reduced me to a nervous wreck. So I learned to say to myself, STIPS, which means stay in the present, stupid. I gave myself this advice in the evenings, and I thanked Maria for helping me. Four weeks later, anyway, back to Brunei. I was back in Brunei again after the holiday in Brisbane, and I was still lying awake at night saying, STIPS, stay in the present, in the middle of the night, in order to get myself to stop worrying about the next day. It was a mantra I repeated to myself on many future occasions before I restarted the school year, which was always a worrying time. Menglait was a regular town school. Physically, it was a shambles and a disgrace for a country which had so much money. But some things about it were significantly better than the water village. First and foremost, I had some upper secondary classes, so the kids could actually understand a fair amount of what I said. Second, the administration, although not particularly welcoming, was not hostile as in the water village. And the administration had a good relationship with the English department, so these were significant differences. Thirdly, the head of department was an expat and very efficient, considering she was working within the constraints of the local context. At the water village, the local HOD was completely ineffectual, and so the expat colleagues tried to take over and work for themselves. Basically, it was a free for all. Then, in some ways, I thought Menglait really was quite therapeutic after the water village, although I would have to stress this was relative. The students were easier to handle, and the administration, although not exactly welcoming, were certainly not as hostile. I had to work out how to survive in the classroom and in the staff room. This was not a straightforward task, but as it turned out, it was just about doable for me. By the end of my second year, I was quite well regarded in the school. Unfortunately, though, I was sufficiently well regarded to be asked to be head of department, and this was a most unwelcome development. This was not a crown to be worn, it was rather something to be avoided in the context, because being head of department in Brunei was not really a promotion, it just meant more work and more responsibility and no autonomy at all to make policy or decisions, and certainly no more money. So HODs were just glorified administrators implementing the policies of the principal and the senior staff. Basically, HODs were routinely used to do the dirty work for senior administrators and to keep those administrators' noses clean. There was nothing given at all to the HOD in return. The very worst thing about being HOD was being closer to these senior administrators, and this meant you were constantly in their sights to take the blame in the blame game. I didn't want the job, but I had it foisted upon me by the previous HOD, who was an interesting character and who's actually a very good HOD for my first 2 years at Menglait. She was calm, considerate, fair and professional, even if a little standoffish on a personal level. Both her children had health issues, and she had a very tough struggle looking after them. In my second year at Menglait, her eldest boy, who was a contemporary of my eldest son, was a senior student in the international school, having been in that school since kindergarten. So she'd been in Brunei for, 15 years or something. Anyway, he fell from grace spectacularly after he was caught stealing a mobile phone and attempting to sell it. The result was suspension from the school at a critical period in his life, just several months before his final exams. He was allowed to take his exams, but was not readmitted to classes. I felt this judgment was unduly harsh, and I urged her to fight it with the board of directors at the time. She did not do this, feeling it was pointless to do so. Well, she had 15 years' experience in Brunei, and I didn't. So who was I to argue? She may have been right, but she was left feeling embittered towards the school. So it was a traumatic year for that family, and at the end of it, she understandably wanted to offload the HOD responsibility, which she did rather clumsily to me. Other candidates didn't want it either. And as I was sort of next in line, I very reluctantly had to agree to take it on, but I had no choice really. The actual job didn't perhaps turn out to be as bad as I had thought, but it definitely increased my stress levels. One of the main reasons for this, ironically, was the HOD herself, because to her surprise, she changed from being a benign head of department to quite a stroppy and uncooperative member of department and colleague. I remember things we had arguments about. One was oral examinations. Every year the school had to supply 2 O-level oral examiners, and this was a very onerous task which took place after school in the afternoons over a period of 2 or 3 weeks. It was very poorly paid and very tedious as well. and everybody hated it. I tried to instigate a system where I thought everyone would take their turn, but the ex-HOD was having none of this. She point blank refused to do it, and this meant that somebody else had to do it, of course. She insisted, and she had her way. I lost a lot of respect for her after that. Later on, we had more confrontations. On one famous occasion, she screamed at me in public. She was in the wrong, and I had actually been trying to act in her interests at the time, but there was nothing I could say or do to mollify her. Aside from my ex-OHOD, the staff at Menglait were a mixed bag. I had a very friendly and productive relationship with an Australian, and we had a great time together, and we became great friends, and we did a lot in the debating together. But most of the colleagues sort of kept to themselves in the first year before I became HOD. But yeah, in that first year, there was one very loud Australian woman who was a problem for me right from the start. She shouted rather than talked in that loud Aussie voice, seemingly oblivious to all around her except the person at whom she was shouting. She repeatedly intruded on and occupied the private space of everyone around her. Murphy's Law had decided that I was the one who was to sit directly opposite her at a workbench, so I could not escape. Her voice had a high-pitched metallic whine, and I duly nicknamed her the Chainsaw. After a couple of weeks, I knew I would have to move away, so I identified a workspace in another staff room, and one day, when no one was looking, I just picked up my things and transferred to another room. I couldn't wait any longer, because the longer I waited, the more obvious it looked that I was moving away from her. She eventually fell out with management later in the year and was asked to leave. She went to the Middle East. Even though Menglait was better than the water village, there was still a tangible sense of insecurity hanging in the atmosphere of the school regarding one's job, which I was never able to get used to. This is something which is impossible to explain to those who have not lived through it. In vain have I tried to explain to my family and friends in the UK and Australia about this sense of insecurity. I've had little success, but it was this tangible insecurity which led me to eschew buying a house and getting a mortgage in Australia. I reasoned that I did not want to be saddled with a mortgage when I might lose my job at any time. This is why we never bought a house when we were in Brunei. The locus of power in the school was difficult to locate, but after about a year or two it became clearer that power appeared to be held mostly by the principal, an aggressive inspectorate, a few important others on the staff, some parents, and even some students. Most of these people derived their power by being related to the royal family in some way. Put simply, one didn't know what the appraisal process was for one's performance. One day, as happened to me eventually at another school, not Menglait, I would emphasize, but one's supervisor would simply come up to one and say, "You need to know this. I was at a meeting of ministry officials yesterday discussing contract renewals, and your name is on the veto list." No reasons would be given to the teacher or to the CFBT supervisor. The veto list, or shit list as we called it, was the list of teachers not recommended for renewal of contract by the principal of the school. How you would come to be on this shit list may or may not have been obvious. In some cases, but not in mine, there would have been a major incident of some sort involving a student or administrator. In other cases, the reason was couched in a vague euphemism such as attitude. In other cases, as in mine, No reason at all was given. But I'm talking about years in the future now. Let us be clear, we were dealing here with the Mao Zedong, Kim Il-sung style of leadership. The only difference between Brunei and China and North Korea was that Bruneian incompetence ensured that the totalitarian style could never really be as effective in Brunei. And it was this inefficiency that made professional life bearable for most of us. The supervisor from CFPT had little or no say in getting your name on or off the shit list. He or she may in some cases have been able to assist in its removal, but it was by no means certain, and even in cases where the teacher had clearly not committed a hanging offence. The local staff were pretty easy to deal with as long as you didn't expect too much of them. There was one who was a little difficult from time to time, but this was because she was related to the royal family. She rarely openly defied me anyway at Menglait, but she did show attitude on one or two occasions. She was eventually poached from us by one of the elite schools. She didn't last there. She had problems in her marriage which led her having to leave that school under a cloud. I had a very good supervisor at Menglait. He had a very good attitude and was supportive of all of us teachers. He was practical and constructive and pragmatic. I felt he would go into bat for me if I had a problem. I didn't have any problems as it turned out at Menglait. But I can't say this about all the other CFBT supervisors I had while in Brunei. I found it best to operate from the premise that they would not go into bat for me if I had a problem. This prevented disappointment. Mine gave me at Menglait very good advice, and I listened to it on more than one occasion. The local administration at Menglait had, as in all Bruneian schools, a very top-down approach. First principal was lazy and just waiting for a couple of years to retire. In a way, this was good for us. He was not anxious to implement the latest ministry directive in order to make a name for himself. After he got to know us expats, he eased off and let us do our own thing. He didn't make policy either. He just implemented ministry directives. He simply delegated everything to his senior staff and read the newspaper in his office. Although gruff at first, he became quite personable towards the end, and he had a sense of humour. In the Bruneian system, life for the staff was easier under such a principle. We were indeed the envy of many other schools. I remember at one famous end-of-year staff meeting, it was mandatory to have at least one staff meeting per year by the principal. And all he did was just read out loud, word for word, everyone's duties which had been written down in the staff handbook, verbatim, out loud. So it was all in Malay too. Still, it was a shortish meeting, about an hour if I remember correctly, and everyone had a good chat as he was doing it. So everyone was satisfied. He retired in 2002, a great loss to the Bruneian educational scene.